Welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I sit down with U.S. alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agent Chris Taylor in his office at the American Embassy in downtown Ottawa. I wanted to find someone who would speak with a level of objectivity about firearms in Canada. I could not think of someone better than an ATF agent who's been working on firearms in our country for the last few years. Chris grew up in Queens, New York, and had a multitude of experiences before joining the ATF, U.S. Marine, construction worker, and Border Services agent. Chris provides us an important overview on illegal guns in Canada and some of the best practices to help reduce the numbers and hold people accountable for their crimes. As always, thanks for listening to the NSP, and please subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to support content development. And now, here's my conversation with Chris Taylor. Chris, welcome to the show. Thanks for hosting me at the Embassy.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Really looking forward to this.
We were just talking before we hit record here that I came across you at a panel discussion with The Economist where you were talking about you're part of the panel. It was all about illegal trade, anti-illicit trade into Canada, and you were covering off on the firearms piece.
Yeah.
And I thought that would be a really interesting guest to have on. And then we got to know each other a little bit, and so not only your knowledge, but I think some of your family background, and then the connections that we have through Chilliwack and a few other things that we'll get into, I thought was really neat. So why don't we kick things off here? And as the listeners know, I always tend to start on the family side. So like, where are the two sides of your family from?
My mother's side, the Vignola side, is from a small town in Naples, Italy, and they immigrated over in 1886. And then my father's side, the Taylor side of the family, they're from Cork County, Ireland, but they didn't come over from there. They were, I guess, family legend has it that my great-grandfather's dad, so my great-great-grandfather was a horse thief in Southern Ireland, and he got busted and then sent to Australia as a penal colony. So the first record we have is from Adelaide, Australia in 1875 when my great-grandfather was born there. John Taylor was born in 1875 in Adelaide, Australia. And that's like the two roots of where my family came over. They immigrated over from Australia in 1885-ish into New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you got horse thieves, horse traders on one side. What does the Italian side of the family do? Naples.
Gerardo Vignola came over in 1886, I think, or 1888 or something. Like, they got his certificate from Ellis Island, and they came over and they went right into like business of some sort. I forget what he actually did, maybe textiles or something like that. And then he married a Salamita, which is the Salamita side of the family. And of course, that's they all had, I think they had 7 kids that were all my, Gerardo Vignola was my mom's grandpa. And then he had Frank Vignola, which is my grandpa. And I think it was like 1912 or something like that. 1917 was it. So he had my grandpa in 1917 in Brooklyn, New York. They're all settled in Brooklyn, New York. And my grandpa, Frank Vignola, met my grandma at like a dance in 1940, I think. Mm-hmm. He was deferred because he had epilepsy.
Okay.
So he was deferred from the draft. And then I thought he worked in like a textile thing again. Like I remember something about textiles or something, like he was a bookkeeper for the textiles. And he met my grandma, Teresa Salamita, in 1940, I think, at a dance. And they were married pretty, like by 1941 or 42, they got married. And then they had my mom in March of, she was the first of 7 kids. And she was born in March of 43. And then they progressed to have another 6 kids after that.
So both sides of the family came through Ellis Island.
Yeah, we haven't found the Irish side yet.
Okay.
Supposedly back in the day, they wouldn't let the Irish offload. and according to family legend, they had to jump off the boat and swim in. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but they really didn't like the Irish back in the 1880s.
Yeah.
It was controlled by the English, the port. I mean, English Americans, of course, but the WASP, as it would be called in the U.S. or in New York. I don't know if you're allowed to say that nowadays, but it may get edited later on. But they didn't like the Irish Catholics coming over,
right.
So I'm not sure if there's a record of their arrival. We haven't found anything at Ellis Island.
Okay.
But they both came into New York, Brooklyn, New York, and in the 1880s. And then, my grandpa, my mom's side, I said he was in like textiles and stuff. And then they had the 7 kids, and my mom, once she graduated high school, she had to go into she became a secretary right away. She had to go into she always wanted to go to college, and college was like so important to her. But I don't think she was ever even given the option, because she had to go to work to help pay for the other 6 kids. So each progressive older kid, then my Uncle Judd had to go to work, to support the other kids. So it was like very interesting. They lived in a one bedroom with 9 people, and Gerardo lived with them, so it was like 10 of them.
Yeah.
Those are the people I grew up with. Like my entire family in New York, when I think about it, was the Irish side played a very limited role in that kind of growing up, because you had my great grandfather who came over when he was like 10 or whatever, with his mom and a bunch of sisters, and that was in the 1880s. And when he was like 20, he got drafted into the Spanish-American War, so he had to go down to John Taylor. That's how we actually found his records, was through the War Department. And so he was like 10 when he came over, plus or minus. I mean, we only know that from his enlistment records that show that he was born. We never got a record from Adelaide. But on his, when he was in the Army, and he had to write down, he was like 5'7", $140, very small guy. But he, date of birth and all it is, place of birth, Adelaide, Australia. That's how we know that that old family legend was probably accurate, about the horse thief.
Right.
Because it was just word of mouth. You don't know, I don't think they had, they may have conviction records in Cork County, but they were basically just trying to kick the Irish out of Southern Ireland, trying to get rid of them, send them off to this island penal colony.
So what was your dad doing when you were growing up? What was his?
So that was John Taylor. Then John Taylor Jr. was born in 1912 in Brooklyn, and he was a tradesman and worked on the the Civilian Conservation Corps out west in the 30s, like doing construction work out there, horseback riding. He was like kind of an adventurer. Then he got drafted in the Army during World War II, and because of his tradesmanship, he became like a combat engineer of some sort, or an engineer. So he'd go out and help build bases. He was in Turkey and everywhere in World War II. He wasn't on the front lines or anything. And then he must have had a leave of absence in 1943, because my dad was born in 1944 in Shreveport, Louisiana.
Okay.
Because I guess that's the base he had to come back to for some, I have no idea whether it was leave or something like that. My dad would know. He's got a great memory. But and then so he was born on an Army base in Shreveport, Louisiana. But their family was from Brooklyn, Queens area. So after the war, he came back, John Taylor Jr. came back with my dad, and my Aunt Michelle was born in 1945, right at and then they relocated or resettled after the Army back to Queens, I think it was. East New York. East New York and Queens are right next to each other, so my mom's family's from East New York, my dad's family's from the Queens area, right next to East New York. But it's you would never know it's a different neighborhood, because it's all merges together, so. And then my parents met in 1970. They went on a blind date kind of. My dad was always tinkering with cars. He was always handy, I guess, from his dad. And then I love tinkering and doing, I built houses, and I always loved that kind of working on cars and stuff. It was just always fun to me. So they met in 1969 or 70. They asked, probably at the beginning of 70. And then my dad was working on a car, and then his friend walked by with 2 women, and they were going out to like for drinks later. So they're like, "Oh, what are you doing?" You know, blah blah blah. And my mom was the other woman. So there was the guy, my dad's friend, and his girlfriend, and the girlfriend's friend was my mom, Carol Vignola. So then it was like kind of a setup, like, oh, you know, thinks he's cute or whatever. You know, he's working on a car. My dad had a coif. He looked like kind of Elvis.
Oh yeah,
Elvis-ish. He had a big coif, and he wore white T-shirts all the time, which. Every picture of me when I was a kid, I was in a white T-shirt. You know, thinking about it, it was jeans and a T-shirt was my entire outfit. Like, and I still wear jeans and a T-shirt. Sometimes they're not white T-shirts anymore, but I mean, I've upgraded to like light blues and greens. I'm really the crazy tailor.
Yeah.
So then they got, so they got married in December of '70. Michael was born in April '71. I was born October '72. Richard was May of '74. David was November '75. So she had 4 boys in 4 years.
Wow.
From 71 to 75.
Did you know your grandfather at all, who served in the Second World War?
Yeah, I know him kind of lightly. I mean, like he kind of moved to Oklahoma when I was probably 8 or 9. So we didn't really grow up with that side of the family.
Right.
That's why, like when I said like that, the influence from that side of the family was more like subdued, but it was prominent, you know, because of the military. And the public servant came from that side of the family, the Irish side of the family. My great-grandpa in the Spanish-American War, then my grandpa in World War II, my dad in Vietnam War, and then I went in during the Gulf War, and then my brother went in soon after that, and my brother Richard joined the Marines. I was in the Marines. Michael was in the Army, my older brother Michael. And then, and it continues to this day, you know, so there's been basically... what Taylor in the American military from 1897 to like pretty much 100 years of Americans either serving in the military or public service.
So did your dad end up in Vietnam?
He got drafted in 65.
Okay.
And then he was assigned to infantry, and he was out in Hawaii about to deploy to Vietnam, and they needed MPs to settle all the strife that was going on outside the bases. And he was 6'2", 210 pounds. So they went through the line, just voluntold him, and then he got assigned to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Real rough assignment during the Vietnam War.
Okay.
Because the company he was with suffered like 75% casualties, you know, so when they went over to Vietnam. So he actually dodged a bullet. It was like, even me, like I was supposed to go in the Gulf War. Then the war ended in like 4 days, and then I wound up like, they said I was in the Mojave Desert waiting to go, and I missed the war.
What was were you born in Queens or grew up in Queens?
Born in Brooklyn, where my mom's family. I was born in where I was baptized, where my great grandpa on my Italian side was baptized. Our Lady of Loretta Church. I don't even think it exists anymore. Me and Michael were born in East New York before they moved to Queens, where my dad's family was in Richmond Hill.
What did the childhood look like in Queens in the 70s and 80s?
It was like kind of like chaotic mayhem. It was always because with my 4 boys in that one, it was a 3-bedroom house, but one room was a storage unit. Like my mom kept all boxes and crap in there. So it was 4 boys in 1 bedroom, and then my parents in 1 bedroom, and it was 2 bunk beds. And then my uncle Gerard's kid, Frankie, was born in '76. And he was always at the house because like his mom worked and his dad was kind of like he was a bookmaker for the Italian mafia, you know, like for those guys, La Cosa Nostra. You know, he was a bookmaker. So you had that kind of like he wasn't around a lot, you know. So with my Aunt Linda working, Frankie was over our house a lot. So during the summer, it was just, you know, from like mid-June to beginning of September, there was 6 boys pretty much in that 1 bedroom. So we had sleeping bags on the floor.
Yeah.
Sometimes we'd have an air conditioner going. Like, I think we got an air conditioner like later on, and I don't remember it being like cool ever. You know what I mean?
Right.
It was just like too small an AC or for too many hot, disgusting kids, you know, like in one room, you know, it's like a sweatshop in there. It was like... So there was always somebody over the house, or there's always like wrestling or sword fights with wiffle ball bats. Like we used to play wiffle ball in the streets and play. There was these old games from that they used to teach us. Skelly. It was like you'd make bottle caps and you'd grab a penny or a couple of pennies, and then you'd melt candle wax into the bottle cap, and it would give it some weight. Then you draw this big square chalk like board on the street, and then with like 9 squares, like a square on each corner, and then a square in each middle, and then a square in the middle. So you'd have to go all the way around the board with these coins, with these bottle caps, and then finish up by trying to get it into the middle square, and then that's how you'd win. And it'd be, 6 to 10 of us playing Skelly sometimes.
Burn hours of time.
Oh, hours and hours. I mean, you'd be like, you'd have to recap it because the wax would be melted or whatever.
Right.
Because it'd be blacktop, in the summer in New York. It was probably very sweltering, and all we had was garden hose water, because my mom would kick us out in the morning, and you weren't coming back in until lunch. Mm-hmm. And then we'd come in for lunch. My mom would have like dozens of sandwiches of like peanut butter and jelly. Usually was a staple, especially when we were young. It'd just be all cut up into squares, and me and my brothers and cousins, and then Jimmy and Brain and Brian, and like the entire neighborhood had kids. So sometimes it'd be 15 to 20 kids my mom would be feeding in the house. And then like right after lunch, the door would hit our ass, and then we wouldn't be allowed in until basically dinner time. The street lights would come on.
So when you were growing up, did you have any sense of what you wanted to do after high school? And I mean, I think it's interesting because I interviewed another person in law enforcement, and he grew up in an area of Winnipeg where sort of half his friends were trending towards criminals and half his friends were trending towards cops. I mean, did you, because you've already mentioned you had an uncle who was a bookie or bookkeeping, but your dad was a cop.
No, bookmaking.
Bookmaking.
Bookkeeping is a little different than bookmaking.
Bookmaking. Yes.
Bookkeeping is a noble profession. I mean, I'm sure some people would say bookmaking is a noble profession as well. But
so did that environment at all sort of tilt you in one way or another? Like how did you sort of view life after Queens as you were growing up?
Well, like it wasn't like you didn't give it much thought, because like I remember the kids, and it's like, what do they want to do? They got to pick a college major. They want to they kind of are being steered in some direction from the high school or whatever, or from parents even nowadays. Like you're talking to your kids, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like my mom used to have this book, and every year with our school picture, it would go on at kindergarten, and it would show the kindergarten picture, and then inside it would be your report card, and then it would be ask you like 5 questions. It would be like, all right, like who's your favorite sports team or whatever, the Yankees or Jets or Giants? And then like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It was like baseball player, like goofy stuff.
I remember these, yeah.
Yeah, so like I think by 3rd grade, I had switched from astronaut. I wanted to be an astronaut for some reason. When I was a kid, I still wanted to be an astronaut. I still want to be an astronaut. I would go up into space tomorrow, bro. I applied for the astronaut candidate position on USA Jobs in 2013 because my buddy sent me the link. I saw that astronaut thing hung on for 40 years, and then he knew it because everybody who knew me I'd want to be an astronaut. That'd be so cool to fly up into space. And I mean, it would probably really be difficult and hard, but when you're a kid, it's like Buck Rogers kind of stuff,
Yeah.
So I wound up applying, and I'm so far the only person I know that got a rejection letter from NASA. So like it's really like, but it goes to my worldview of don't talk yourself out of something. Let them tell you no. You know what I mean? Ask, keep going, like apply for the craziest thing. Just try. The worst that could happen is they say no, which is probably the outcome I was expecting, because when they said they needed a science degree, I'm not sure if political science was the kind of science they were looking for. Political science. I was like, what kind of science? I was like, political. Like literally, I have a political science degree. And it's just like, you know what? Let them tell me no. Let them say no to me. So in 2014, I must have been 42 years old. I got a rejection letter. I was like, bro, you sent monkeys into space. You can't send me. I'm smarter than a chimp. Come on, bro. But so when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. And then it became like baseball player or something. And then because we were in the Little League at the time, we used to play. My mom always had us in baseball when we were kids, up until like high school, I think. So it was baseball for a while. But there was like, my dad was a cop, and then, so that was in my head, seeing him in uniform, going to a precinct when I was a kid, and then like hearing the stories about him in the Army and seeing the pictures, and then seeing his grandpa, my grandpa, his dad, in the Army, So they weren't always in my life, but the influence was there, on the Irish side, And then when I was a teenager, I found out because my grandpa on my Irish side, I think it was his first wife they had a kid together, and then she moved. Like, I guess that's how they divorced in the old days. They just moved. Didn't tell them where they were going, blah, 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 like nothing. So years later, when I was like a teenager, we find out we got this new aunt. My dad has an older sister, like 7 years older than him, from a first marriage that no one knew about. They didn't talk about this crap back in the day. And she had found my grandpa through the War Department records, that he served in World War II and everything else, and that matched up with John Taylor, who was, her dad, basically. So my dad had another sister. And that's how we found out all that background up from the War Department, from the John Taylor Sr. and then John Taylor Jr. and all of that stuff. But but you had this like service line on my Irish side, and then this kind of like I don't think anybody was in the public service on my Italian side, other than I'd say the influence was I guess the lifestyle of my Uncle Gerard, like he used to show up and like he'd always have cash with him. So it was like he did this mysterious thing, and he would go on vacation, random vacations, like
bookmaking, not bookkeeping.
Bookmaking, and sometimes, you'd hear these stories about my dad knocking on the door at my mom's family's house in Brooklyn, and he'd be in uniform. He was a cop, and then my Uncle Gerard, they used to go to the window on the third floor and then drop the keys down. That's how you'd get in. You'd ring the bell.
Okay.
Then you'd look out the window. If you'd be like, "Oh, who is it?" And then you'd drop the keys down. They'd open the door, lock the door, then come upstairs. So I guess there's a story about when my dad was going there for lunch at my grandma's house in Brooklyn, my Italian side grandma. He rings the bell, and then my Uncle Gerard looks out, and all he sees is the uniform. And they said he was in Canarsie before my dad even got the keys. Like, he looked down, and he just bolted. And then my grandpa went to the window, looked down, he's like, "Hey, Mike," he's like, why didn't he throw down the keys? He's like, he didn't know it was you. Like, it was that kind of thing where, you had this Italian side with the connection to that side of the world. And then my dad's side of the family was always kind of this straight kind of, like, do your job, public servant. My dad was always like a cop or doing something along those lines. And the Italian side, probably the influence of the Italian side was the closeness of family and hugging and like my the way I talk with my hands. That's definitely the Italian side. And your affection, very affectionate. We grew up as Italians, like Brooklyn Italians, not right off the boat. They used to say right off the boat from Brooklyn. That's how long the families have been in Brooklyn. Is when they moved to Queens, they're right off the boat from Brooklyn.
Oh, really?
They're not even off the boat from Italy anymore. They were off the boat so long that they're now off the boat from Brooklyn when they moved to Queens. So there was like a New York saying.
Yeah.
I don't even know. It's probably could be offensive nowadays. I have no idea, but I'm just like one of those people. It's hard to keep up with what would offend people, so it's like I'm just going to talk the way I talk. And
how did you go from Queens to the Marines then?
So when we were in high school, me and my brother, I was kind of like I wouldn't say a delinquent, but like what happened was in elementary school, I was kind of like, I was a normal elementary school kid. I didn't have any real problems in elementary school. Then I went to junior high school, and it was junior high school 226. It was a pretty rough junior high school in like South Ozone Park, and like you took the city bus there and stuff, and like I was like 12 years old or whatever. And they just give you a bus pass, and you're on the bus with all these crackheads and stuff. It's just like, it's a very different world over there. They don't have like school buses. They just give you a city bus pass, and you got to take the bus as a 12-year-old by yourself, whatever. So me and my brother would take the bus down to junior high school 226, and then I got into like a fight like within the first month or two because some kid was doing something, and they tried like pick on you, like that kind of to test you. It was almost like a prison. It seemed like. As a kid, man, it was on like Donkey Kong from the day you went in there, and it was really very mixed school and very like I'd say low income area, and so it was like I got into a fight within a month or two. Then I wound up like stabbing a kid with a pencil by the fourth month or fifth month because of a disagreement, and then I bit like a chunk of flesh out of this kid's chest by like probably the end of the first year, seventh grade. This is seventh grade. It's like I was 13, biting a chunk of flesh out of a kid's chest, and we were grappling in the hallway. And then by eighth grade, I had found my oats, and now it was like I was one of those kids that, like, if you're going to pick on me, you're going to get, like, popped in the nose. Because my dad used to be like, don't let anybody pick on you because then they'll never stop. From there, I wanted to go to the high school, the local high school, the public one, with my friends, of course. And my parents were like, no, you're going to Archbishop Malloy. I was like, I don't want to go to a Catholic school where it's disciplined and it's all boys. I want to go with my friends, you know.
It's like a Catholic school with uniforms, or?
Oh, yeah, shirt and tie and everything.
Yeah.
And then, of course, like, you don't have any say when you're 13 years old or whatever, going into the ninth grade. So they sent me to Archbishop Malloy. I later, you know, obviously I was on a track to, you know, my mom always says I was going on one path, like the law enforcement, or the other path was the criminal side. Like, and she said, like, we got to steer him this way. Because she didn't want me going that way because it was like very, I would have been very good at it, I think. But my mom was worried about me, you know, following her younger brother's footsteps, you know. And then, so they pushed me into Archbishop Malloy and then got in there and kind of like, after my first year of, I mean, I was resistant, I was everything in Malloy, but those brothers were allowed to hit you back in the day. They would whack you in the head. They had tassels with these little sharp instruments in it. They'd poke you in the ribs. And you'd be like, holy shit. Like, and they'd be like, get to class. Like, it was very disciplined. Like, there were no chairs in the lunchroom. All standing, the chest-high tables. You had 15 minutes to eat, and then they kicked you out. Didn't matter if it was snowing, raining, hailing, sleet. They kicked you out without your jacket. 15 minutes just suffering. In the summer, it was okay. In the winter, it got brutal. And then I kind of, like, found my legs by sophomore year or second year, grade 10. By grade 11, I had calmed down. I hadn't gotten to a fight or anything. And then me and this guy, Christian, were grappling a little bit. And he open hand smacked me in the mouth. And then my old school, like 226, junior high school 226 rage came out. And I grabbed him and threw him through a window. And he got like stitches on his back, like 60 stitches on his back. And I remember when I threw him and I held on to him because I didn't want him going through. I didn't realize that he would actually go through the window and break the glass. I pulled his chest forward and I looked and I saw like just red streaks coming down his back, and I was like, oh shit, Chris, I think I screwed up. He's like, what? Does this look bad? I was like, don't worry about it. We're going to take you to the hospital. Somebody was in Mr. Santos's class, and then the principal came up. We both, actually, to the school's credit, they gave us both community service because they knew we were both assholes. Like, we were both, so we had to do like 60 hours of community service and scrubbing bird shit off statues and doing everything around the school. And then around that time is when, it was probably my sophomore year, in grade 10, was when my brother Michael wanted to go to the Army recruiting station. Okay. And then, so he's in the Army so we always took the bus together, you know. He was like your brother, like we were one grade apart. So I wasn't going to be like, all right, see ya, you know, we just went as brothers. And then, so he would talk to the Army guy, and I was just sitting in the hallway, like, whenever he would go in and meet with him and discuss, like, you know, college options or anything. And I was in the hallway, I think it was probably the second or third visit, and I was like wearing a shirt and tie, but my tie was like this shiny, like pink, skinny tie, you know. It was like all hand-me-downs. I mean, I used to get made fun of all the time because my brother's clothes, my brother's friends would always be like, oh, I recognize that shirt, because sometimes they'd have holes in the pants or whatever, but, you know, it was our slacks or whatever. And they always remember the ties. They'd make fun of my ties. But I was like, I don't have a tie collection. Like, I just get whatever I get.
I'm 16. Like, what do you want me to do?
I'm like 15 years old. I just get whatever we got. So I was wearing the tie, and this big dude, he's probably like 6 foot, probably 260 pounds of raw muscle. Like, you know, the ones where the shirts are ripping? Yeah. Like, it looks like they can't fit anymore. And he's like, hey, kid, what are you doing here? I said, oh, I'm just waiting on my brother, you know. And he's talking to the Army recruit. He's like, what's with that goddamn tie? I was like, I was like, because he was like one of those drill instructor looking guys, you know, like just so dead serious. He's like, well, if you want to become a man, step into that office. And I was like, I didn't even know it was an option. Like, it was just like 15 probably in grade 10. Yeah, probably 14, 15. I don't even know. Yeah. Because I graduated when I was 17. So this has got to be 14, 15 years old.
Okay.
And then I go in the office reluctantly. I didn't know what the hell was going to happen. And he hands me this like brochure where the guys are like shooting missiles and machine guns and faces painted and everything else. And I was like, this looks cool as hell. Like, I'd love to blow crap up. Wouldn't that be fun, shooting machine guns and stuff? So basically that was my introduction to Marine Corps right there on the spot. And then, so the Marines looked like an awesome idea. So I wanted to join on my 17th birthday. But I was I had just turned 17 in senior year. So in October of senior year, I graduated when I was 17. So on October 12th of 1989, the recruiter came by the house to sign my enlistment papers. And my mom lost her shit. Like, she was okay up until we sang happy birthday, and then we were going to, and it was basically an Entenmann's cake. I don't know if you know what Entenmann's cakes are.
No.
That was our birthday party. Like, we weren't big on birthdays. My mom was not a big birthday person, so we had an Entenmann's cake. It's like a store-bought cake that's sold in like every grocery store.
Like a slab cake sort of thing?
Not even.
Oh,
it's like a crumb cake. It could be like, crumb cakes and stuff. So it's like a crumb cake, but it's like Entenmann's are like all over New York. It's like, if you bring Entenmann's, like if you go to somebody's house, you bring an Entenmann's. So this would be, we'd have that every weekend, but if it was your birthday, they'd put candles on it. And it would be the same people that were there. Yeah. Same uncles and aunts, same cousins, and it would just be your birthday, and then sometimes you'd get a 20 from one of your uncles or something. So this was my birthday party. Yeah, it was on my date of my birthday. It was like a Thursday or some shit, but the recruiter came over, and we're going to enlist on my 17th birthday with parental consent you need. My mom just lost her marbles, started pounding the table, crying. You're not taking my goddamn son. She starts screaming at this recruiter. And now I'm just like, oh my God, like, this is mom versus recruiter. I think the recruiter's going to lose this one because mom's a crazy, Italian old woman. And she just like went hysterical on this guy. And I was just, like, my dad like grabbed my mom's elbow and walked her into the kitchen. I heard her, no, Mike, they're going to kill him. They're going to kill him. And she just like really lost her shit. And the recruiter's like looking at me. I was like, I don't even know what to do. I'm like 17. Like, I have no idea. And then my dad's like, Chris, come in here. And I was like, all right. I went into the kitchen, and he's like, look, I know you can have one parent sign up and give permission, but your mom would divorce me. So the only way this is going to work is if you join the reserves, and then later on, if you want, you could convert over when you're not under our control.
Right.
But when you're 17, we're not approving you. So then so we signed up for the reserves. So I got like June 7th of 1990 is when I was going to Paris Island. And then, so I missed all the grad parties and everything because I was like, right after graduation, I graduated on like a Friday. On that Tuesday, I was shipping out, to Paris Island.
Yeah.
So that's why I joined the reserves instead of the active duty. I was supposed to be active duty, but then I went to Paris Island for like 13 weeks, graduated, had 10 days leave.
So Paris Island is where?
South Carolina.
Okay.
And then we went back. Then I went back to my MOS, Military Specialty School, which was your occupation.
Yeah, you start as a Marine, and then they train you in something specific. But every Marine's has that basic
every
training
Marine's
first.
like basically trained as infantry.
Yeah.
At a boot camp, you go through like 3 weeks of infantry training in boot camp, and it's very, very much every Marine's a rifleman, and they hone that into you. It doesn't matter if you later become a cook or whatever, or an admin, whatever. You got to be a killer, So they train you on I think it was like 2 weeks or 3 weeks in boot camp, dedicated just infantry tactics and everything else, and shooting every type of weapon. Then if you're infantry MOS, then in 1990 they had this thing called MCT, Marine Combat Training. So every Marine after the 10 days of leave had to go back to Camp Lejeune for 3 weeks of MCT. Sometimes it was called Marine Custodial Training, but it was Marine Combat Training because when you weren't training for combat, they don't want you ever being bored. A bored Marine is a dangerous Marine.
Idle hands.
Yeah, you'll start like throwing rocks at like bombs and like stupid shit. That Marines will get in trouble if they're bored. So when you weren't shooting things and blowing things up and hiking and humping everywhere, you were cleaning up the base. So we used to call it Marine Custodial Training. So then it was like 3 weeks of that for everybody that just graduated. So you're in the same class with everybody else for another 3 weeks of just pure, unadulterated, blowing, like running with logs on your shoulders, like just crazy, like more infantry kind of killer tactics. Then if you're infantry, then you got to go to 2 months of infantry training after that. So now you had your 2 weeks there, your 3 weeks here, then the radiomen go to radio school. And then everybody goes motor T, whatever. If you had a real, like an MOS at action. Like the infantry guys, they just left them behind and then switched barracks over here. And now you're still doing the same things for the next 2 months.
Is that what you did?
Yeah, I was infantry. So then by December 20th, I graduated, and the Gulf War was heating up. There was deploying troops. I remember seeing the C-130s going over our heads and stuff. You didn't get too much news. You heard about something in the Persian Gulf, but then they were saying USMC stood for You Suckers Miss Christmas, because we graduated December 20th. And because I had to join the reserves, I was going back to New York, and the rest of the guys were getting right from there, right to the Middle East. I think they were giving them a couple of days off, but I went back to New York, and by the time I got back to New York, by the 22nd, I had received a registered mail activating me for the first time since the Korean War. So
were you in the Marine Reserve still at this point?
No, I had just entered the Marine Reserves and then got reactivated into active duty, which hadn't happened since the Korean War. So my mom's like, "You son of a bitch! How did you pull this off?" I was like, "I didn't pull anything off. It's a war." So then by January 10th, I was getting deployed out to Camp Pendleton because they were going to do desert warfare training.
Which is out in California, right?
Yeah, it's Southern California. And then went from there. We were out there for January, February, and then I think the war started in January 20th or something, if I remember correctly, January, right around there. And then it was they were gearing us up to ship us out. We were supposed to go to San Diego and deploy. We still had the green camis. Everything was green still, at the beginning of the first Gulf War. And then the war ended in 4 days. And then we just had to they were going to send us to Bangladesh or something to help with flooding. And I was like, whoa, time out. I don't go war here. I was because, when you train for that, it's so interesting because I was never warlike. I mean, I was aggressive and I defended myself, but never I didn't want to kill anybody as a normal kid. But then when you're in the boot camp and infantry school and then they train you to fight, you want to fight. You're geared up. I was just turned 18 years old and I was ready to go, All of a sudden it was a big letdown. It was the war's over. What are you talking about? I was this is bullshit. I've been working at this for 9 months now. I want to at least go take over a village or something. No. And then they basically they kept us on active duty until they made sure everything was good over there.
Yeah, sure.
And then by June of 91, I think it was, they were de-escalating, sending everybody back home. And then they asked if I wanted to stay on. And so I stayed on and I did some, they wanted assistance with the recruiting station in New York. So they kept me on active duty. So I stayed on active duty until pretty much this master gunnery sergeant was like, "Taylor, you can't do this. Just go to college. Go to college. And if you want to keep doing it, do it as a second lieutenant. You just you need to go to college." And I was like, all right. So in September 91, I went to Nassau Community College. And then I went to the community college for the first year. And then I went out to California in 92. My brother Michael had moved out to California. Went out there in 92. Strangely enough, I'm meeting my buddy Jimmy was out there with me from the block. And then my buddy Brian Pickford had joined the Marines after I had joined the Marines. And he was out in Camp Pendleton. And my brother worked at Anaheim, California at a hotel. So then me and Jimmy took the rental car, drove down to Camp Pendleton, picked up Brian, drove him back. Then when we were leaving to drive him back, because it was a Friday, we picked him up, and he had to be back at Sunday by 3 p.m. or something. You know the military, when you're on active duty. So we drove him down. We were driving him down on a Sunday afternoon or something at 4 o'clock. And these two women, beautiful women, young women, our age, I was 19 or whatever, 20, 19, I think. They flagged us down. And, Chris, my grandpa always said I had a face for radio, but literally they flagged us down. I was like, damn, I'm sexy, I'm getting flagged down by two beautiful women that were dressed very nice. And then I stopped. I was like, hey, what's going on? And they were like, oh my God, we're so sorry. We thought you were somebody else. And I was like, well, I could be somebody else. And that wound up being my wife. So my wife of 30 years, like
right.
literally that was Christy. And her and her girlfriend were meeting somebody in a red rental car.
She's from Chilliwack, BC.
Yeah, she's from Chilliwack. She was just down there. Her and her girlfriend drove down like 20 hours over 2 days to get down there. And they wanted to go see the sights in Southern California. So we exchanged phone numbers, and then they went home, and then we went back to New York. And then my brother was trying to convince me to go out to Anaheim and live out there. And I was like, all right. And I only had done my first year of school, and I was like, well, all right, I'll go live in California for a little bit, like that'd be fun. And I went out there in like September of 92. And then all the time I was still talking to this woman, Christy, up in Chilliwack. So we moved out to California. I moved out to California. And at least, I'd be with my brother, staying with Michael and Peter in L.A., and they got me a job at the front desk. Well, then about like 2 weeks, my brother had to fire me because I sucked. I was not a good customer service. Like, if somebody's a dumbass, it's hard for me to just kiss their ass and be like, oh, okay, it was my fault. And then, so I got fired by my brother, and I was like, bro, that's jacked up. You're firing me? Like, he's like, I know, like, it just sucks, but you are horrible at this job. And I was like, God, I said, if I told Mom, she would be pissed. And he's like, all right, like, just keep this between us. So then I had called Christy later that day. She's like, so what are you going to do now? I was like, I don't know. I'm just going to find a job doing something, She's like, well, my dad's in construction up here. My uncle's in, like, they build houses. Can you build houses? I was like, yeah, I can build houses, Never built a house in my life. Never. I mean, I hammered nails and stuff at the time. But I figured out, I could do it. I was in the Marines. It's just funny when you're young and you do this, like just very, very mentally challenging and difficult thing like Paris Island, or then infantry school and MCT, and then all the Camp Pendleton stuff. Where you're like hiking for 25 miles with like huge rock on your back and a dragging round. And it's just awful. And you figure after you do that, you can pretty much do anything that comes up. I mean, everything seems easy after that. So I was like, yeah, all right. I said, how much do you think it costs up there? And she's like, I don't know. How much do you got? It's like, I remember it was like $106 on my last statement thing. And I was like, got to try and make it last. She's like, all right, well, let me know what you want to do. And I was like, I checked. And you couldn't even check online. You'd have to call.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I called Alaska Air. I was like, how much would one way to Vancouver be? They're like, oh, like $150. I was like, ugh. What about like Seattle? They're like, that'd be like all in like $99. I was like, all right, that'd give me like $7. At least I could get some food when I get up there, So I took a little brown bag and my green duffel bag. That's all I had in my life. And then I flew up to Seattle. And then Christy picked me up at Seattle Airport. We drove up over the border, used to just a driver's license back in the day.
Yeah, that's right.
It was just a DL, and the border was like three people. It was like so easy. It was like, and you're like, oh, they were the most friendly, like, because I had never left the country. And I'm like up in Canada as building houses up there until like December, and then I knew I had to go back to New York to finish school. So I went back to New York with Christy in tow.
Okay.
And then she started working in Brooklyn. We got her a job off the books at a fruit market in Brooklyn. And then I went to finish my second year. So by 93, 94, I had finished my second year. Then we drove back out to Canada. Her parents had moved up to like 100 Mile House, like British Columbia.
Yep.
But actually 21 miles northeast in a small town called Forest Grove by Canham Lake, BC. Then we drove from Queens, New York, all the way out there. And then I was like working up there building houses again. I think it was March of 94. I moved down to Seattle just to get my residency so I could go to the UW, University of Washington, and complete my degree. But all during that time, so now I'm down in Seattle and I'm working down there, go up to visit her mom, and her mom and dad had split. And then I'm getting dumped still. I'm still a lookout or whatever. I'm in the system. I think they had me tagged as a vagrant.
Right, so when you say dumped, you mean they're going through your vehicle every time?
Every time.
Yeah.
Secondary, like in customs. They had me listed as a vagrant, as a cigarette smuggler. They had me listed as probably an illegal alien, which I was back. I didn't realize you needed I was just building houses for cash. It seemed normal to me growing up in New York. And then, so I got to know the guys at customs. So then once I was approaching 96 to get my bachelor's degree, I started asking them, I said, how much do you make for busting my chops all the time? And they told me the amount. I was like, holy God, that's a lot of money. Back in the day, from a kid's perspective. I was like, I need an application. Can you give me an application? I can do what you guys do. I can bust balls like all day. I go, that's all you do. You don't find nothing on me. You bust my chops and you don't find anything every time. So then they gave me an application. That's how I got in the feds. Was by the CBP, the customs guys. And then a year later, that was like I was, at the airport going through bags and looking for dope and everything else at LAX. And then my son was born. And my son was like 6 months old when we moved to LA. And then my wife got pregnant again somehow, in 97. And then I found a guy in New York that wanted to transfer with me. So we transferred ports. And then in 97, I moved to New York.
Okay.
With my pregnant wife and my 1-year-old son. And then my daughter was born 2 months later in New York, but I had all my family around at least. So it was a much easier existence with that big family, like all my brothers and cousins and my mom and dad and everything. So then we were in New York for 2 years. Then I switched from customs in 99 to immigration as a special agent. Because I wanted to be a special agent. I wanted to be out of the uniform. And then... So
is that a completely different organization?
Completely. It was U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Okay. INS. So it went from U.S. Customs Service to immigration. And then all during this time, you have to go down to Georgia at this academy. It's called FLETC, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Brunswick, Georgia. And when you're down there, you hear these guys explosions going off. And you're like, what the hell is that? And they're like, oh, that's the ATF guys. The crazy dudes out there in the wood. They're in the back of the place and they're blowing up cars all the time. I was like, damn. So when I was at INS, I was like, where's that ATF thing? So I went to the ATF. And at the time, it was just a trailer. Was there Academy staff room or whatever, the admin? So I walked up to the trailer and a couple of guys were out on the porch smoking. They're like, and they're mostly Southern. They're like, hey, how you doing, kid? Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, hey, how do I get on with you guys? I said, they're like, who you with now? I said, immigration. They're like, immigration? You don't want to do that. Come. And I said, yeah. I said I was in the Marines. I was customs. And they're like, oh, all right. Go talk to Bob. He was the head of the academy. So me and Bob would have cigarettes, smoking darts on the back porch. And I'd be asking him questions. And he's like, give me your application. I'll see what I can do. And then I get back to New York in 99. And by 2001... Bob calls me. He's like, hey, you're set up for an interview, in the World Trade Center. I was like, all right, what day? He's like, going tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. It was very informal and very,
So it was 2 years you were waiting before you could get in?
Not even 2 years. It was all nebulous, Okay. It wasn't I gave him an application, handed it to this dude. I didn't know if there was an opening. I had no idea, And then... a year later, he calls. He's like, hey, can you go in for an interview? I was like, yeah, all right. So I go into the World Trade Center for an interview, and my dad knew some of the guys from when he was a cop, whatever. They're like, oh, you're Taylor, Taylor, Bob Whitney, and, put in a good word. And was just sitting there talking, and I kept, waiting for the interview to start. And I was like, are we going to, ask me questions and stuff? They're like, no, kid, we just want to get to know you, whatever, I was like, what? It was it. And they don't tell me anything. They were smack my shoulder with all laughing. I was like, what the hell's going on here? Never have I been to an interview like that. It was just so casual. And then, what was it? It was probably, that was in 2000, June maybe, or July. And by December, they're like, hey, can you start in 2 weeks in Seattle? I was like, Seattle? What the hell's Seattle? I want to, I'm in New York. I'm finally back here. I don't want to go back out to Seattle. They're like, well, we got a lot of agents in New York, and we need extra people in Seattle. And you had Seattle, you graduated from the University of Washington. We figured you had connections out there. I was like, no, I don't have any connections other than my wife's family lives 2 hours north of there. That's about it. So I was like, all right, I'll take Seattle.
At some point, did you specialize in firearms, or is that just something that all ATF agents tend to have a level of expertise in?
Yeah, we're trained in that at the academy, and then just by periphery, you're always dealing with firearms. Because, even with bombing cases, a lot of times these guys may have a gun, whatever, when you arrest them, and you're always laying charges on firearms. There's specific, firearms trafficking groups, and then arson explosives groups, and then, violent street gangs, usually. It depends on the city. And then, but I started off in A&E, like arson explosives, and then in 2005 I switched over to street. There was like a street crimes unit, and then we were buying informants, buying dope using informants, undercover gun purchases and stuff like that, and like murder for hires and stuff. So that was in 05 to 07. So then we just kind of stayed there. I was in headquarters from 07 to 10. Then I went out to the arson explosives group in Baltimore, which was busy as hell. You can imagine Baltimore's not exactly like a quiet place. So did that for 2 years, and then I came back into headquarters again, and I went to international affairs from 12 to 15, and that's when I was doing a lot of international firearms trafficking.
Okay.
That was my first intro from 12 to 15 when I was the deputy chief and then the chief of ATF's international operations for our entire international footprint. That's where I got introduced to international firearms trafficking. Then in 15 to 19, I went up to Philadelphia to be the number 2 for the state of Pennsylvania. It's called the ASAC, Assistant Special Agent in Charge. And then that was in 19. I was getting tired of that because that's like you're in charge of everything, like any bombings, mass shootings, fires, mass casualty events for the whole state of Pennsylvania. I'd be going out to these things. So it's very busy, very hectic. Consider you got Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, Allentown, like it's a pretty big state. And then I was just getting tired of that, so I started putting out feelers for different jobs. And then one of the guys I knew from International was now the chief of International, my old job. And he called me. He's like, "Hey, bro, you want to go up to Ottawa?" I was like, "Dude, it's cold as hell up there. What the hell I want to go up to Ottawa for?" He's like, "I heard you were looking." I said, "All right, let me run it by the old lady." And she's Canadian, so of course she was a little biased. She's like, "Oh, yeah." I mean, she'd never been to Ottawa. She'd never been to Ontario. Never been to Quebec. Literally, she's a BC girl. And had left there in 30 years or whatever. At the time, 2019, she probably left there 27 years earlier. And then never went back to Canada other than British Columbia. Because it's not like a prime vacation spot for a New Yorker. You don't think they'll go to Ontario. You want to go to the Bahamas or Puerto Rico or Florida. Just in Queens, Queens, New York. I don't think I knew anybody that ever went anywhere but Montreal.
Yeah.
That was Canada to us. And then, and that's because they could drink at like 19 or 18 up there. Because most people went up there for that.
Right, yeah, of course.
And I think it's still 18 or 19, right?
I think so. I think it's 18, yeah.
Yeah, so then we moved up to Ottawa. And then we've been up here now for 5 years. And then, so when I came up here, it was just like, to get an idea of the landscape up here was very, it's daunting. It's like, I was the only person up here for the first probably just over a year. I came up in September of 19, and I was supposed to get a number 2 in Toronto in like this January of 20. But then it got pushed back to like April of 20, and then what happened in March of 20? It's COVID, and then he wound up not getting up here for till like I think September of 20, I think October of 20.
So what do you focus on?
Mostly firearms trafficking.
Okay.
From the firearms recoveries in Canada, when they get recovered, there's like a serial number. Most people are familiar with there's a serial number embedded into the firearm. If you trace that serial number, it tells you where it started. In the United States, we have these the firearms licensees, and they keep track of this. So what happens is when you trace a firearm in Canada and it comes back to just say Florida or Ohio or Georgia, it'll give you what's called a time of purchase. So within ATF, the shorter time to purchase to recovery time, which we call time to crime, it's from the time of purchase to the time of recovery. But it was always referenced to as a TTC, time to crime. So purchase date, basically, we look at that gap of time. The shorter the gap of time, the more likely it was like just trafficked, Okay. So we look at 1 year or less up here in Canada. We used to look at a wider amount, but sometimes it gets, like just say it's 10 years or 15 years ago, it was bought by you down in Florida. And it's just a possession charge up here in Toronto, just say. For ATF to expend the resources to close that 15-year gap of where that firearm went for the last 15 years is sometimes difficult, if not impossible, to do. We will try on special cases like where if a cop is shot or if there's a mass homicide or something like some tragedy occurs, or if it's like a very significant investigation, then we'll try and close a gap of any amount of time. You can have a gap of 20 years sometimes from the time it was purchased to the time it was recovered. Closing that gap is very difficult. It's 20 years of people either knowing or not knowing, or not having a record of something, or being deceased, so it's very difficult to close the gap if it's too long. So we focus on the 1 year time to crime or less.
Okay.
So if it's bought within the last 365 days, generally we're going to send the lead down there to Florida or Ohio or Texas, wherever the point of origin is, and then investigate that person who bought it.
So if you've already got the firearm off the street, what is the importance of tracing that firearm? That's
a great question, because what happens is a lot of cops, a lot of uniformed officers in Canada, you guys aren't as, to say, it's a similar gun culture, but the most Canadian cops I deal with have never held a pistol before they were a cop. A lot of Canadians, it's a very pro-gun culture. It's really, mostly with long guns, hunting rifles and stuff. Your pistols are, there was always restricted by RPALs, the restricted possession and acquisition license. But so the familiarity with the handguns and firearms is not the same as the United States. They're not familiar with ATF. They're not familiar with tracing. Like in the U.S., that's a very common thing amongst gun owners. They know who ATF is. Up here, they're not that familiar with it. So when a cop arrests somebody with a possession charge and they put the gun on the pegboard in the vault, they think it's done and over with. Like it's just, right. I got you with the gun. You're going to do 3 months or 6 months in jail. The gun's in there. No problem.
Gun's off the street. What does it matter?
It's done. Yeah, right. But that gun now, just say Joe, we'll call it. Joe is a guy in Florida buying 2 guns a week, ships up to Edmonton, or just say Calgary. Every time, he ships it up, and these guns keep filling your pegboard in their police department of jurisdiction, and there's no way for us or you guys to know that Joe is the one buying 2 guns a week, every week of the year, just continuous dripping them into Canada. It could be 10 guns in the box. We don't know. So what happens is when the cops don't trace the firearms, when the police departments don't trace the firearms, it never allows us to know who Joe is. So now you could get, just say, one of Joe's guns every week for the next 52 weeks. In that time, you've arrested, just say, 52 people that are going to get 3 to 6 months each. But Joe is still shipping the guns. So Joe's, just say, if he shipped 10 guns a week, that's 520 guns he's shipped up. Now next year, you're going to arrest 52 more people. You're going to have 52 more gun charges. They're going to do 6 months apiece. And there'll be another 520 minus the ones that you recovered. We need to know that. We need to identify Joe so that ATF in Florida could go visit Joe and shut him down, arrest him, throw him in jail, whatever. He's shipping international firearms. That would be an international firearms trafficking case. And we would investigate that person and arrest them and convict them, and they'd get years in prison. And they wouldn't be buying guns anymore. So it's like getting it at the source. There was that old parable about, when you're in a river and a baby's floating down, you go out and grab the baby, save the baby, and then another baby's floating down. Eventually you got to go up the river and find out who's throwing babies into the river.
Right.
You can't just stand there all day and keep letting. So, it's like that. So that's how important firearms tracing is, because you never know. It could be one guy, it could be 10 guys that have a ring down there in Georgia.
Yeah.
And are shipping guns, and if we don't trace them in Canada, you'll never know the source. And if we don't know the source, we can't attack the source for the U.S. sourced firearms. There's also a large amount of domestically sourced handguns in Canada that, generally speaking, I'd say across the country, if you see a firearm with a serial number, especially a handgun, serial number obliterated, it generally means that it's from an RPAL.
Okay.
Because they're the only ones who care about if we trace the gun. Now think about it. You're in Florida. They generally don't obliterate the serial numbers because they don't care. It's going up to a foreign country. There's no real immediacy to it. Well, if you have an RPAL and you have 10 Glocks on your RPAL, and now you sell one off the side, a criminal act in Canada, if they find it, any cop can run that serial number and it'll pop up in the registered restricted gun database. So they generally tend to obliterate the serial number, grind it off with a Dremel or something like that. and then they sell the gun to their friend. And then if the cops show up at their door, then they claim that it was stolen or something like that. That's the general, so if you look at Canada nationally, it's generally about 44% are sourced from the United States of recovered firearms.
Okay.
And 56% are domestically sourced. But within that 56% of domestically sourced firearms, a large portion of those are imported legally from the United States, mostly like long guns and stuff like that, like hunting rifles. You guys don't have any firearms manufacturers in Canada per se. So wherever any firearms generally recovered, unless it's an old Cooey or something, a domestically made firearm decades ago, it's generally going to be either U.S. sourced smuggled, the 44%, or it's U.S. sourced imported, which then becomes a Canadian domestic problem, because you're shipping it into some firearms dealer or wholesaler in Canada, and then it gets trafficked somewhere along the commercial system somewhere. You buy it and then you sell it. You saw off the barrel and you sell it to your friend, and then it's like in domestic circulation at that point.
So, other than the obvious of getting illegal guns off the street, what are the other benefits then? Because it's not just going to be Joe down in Florida with 2 guns a week. I mean, this could obviously be larger criminal enterprises as well.
Yeah, the thing about it is it appears after 5 years I've been up here, it appears that it's loosely affiliated. Like sometimes you'll see like a bunch of stores in Dallas. Tracy's going back to that.
Okay.
So our guys in Dallas will work that up as an investigation, and they'll round up a local crew of people that are buying guns for people up here. But it's funny the way, because like when you look at like large drug shipment seizures, let's just say a ton of coke comes into like Moncton or St. John, New Brunswick, you never see like a cargo container of guns. It's usually the most I've seen is like 249 lower receivers smuggled in to Quebec from upstate New York on a sled. The guy was dragging a sled through the woods with 249 lower receivers a couple of years ago.
Physically dragging it across the border?
Physically walking over the border. He hits a sensor, trips a sensor. They go out there, and he's like some goofball with like 249 guns in his lower receivers. I mean, so that's like a large one. Normally it's below, I'd say, they've had a couple of where it's like 60 guns, 50 guns, and like a gas tank or something. But I've never seen or heard of any cargo container or a large-scale shipment. Like, just say the cartels were moving it. I don't think they could do it piecemeal like they do in the southern border. But generally, I haven't seen any large-scale shipments. Like the largest one is the 250. But generally, it'll be you got a lot of snowbirds here that go down to Florida. They go down to Georgia. They go down to Phoenix. They go down to Texas in the winter. They make friends. They realize that it's very lucrative. You could buy a Glock, $500 in most states, and you sell it in Canada, $5,000 to $7,000. During COVID, I think the price went up to like $7,000 to $9,000 for that same Glock. So it's very lucrative, and I think you get like these normal Canadians that'll just be like, all right, you know what, I need some extra bucks. Like, could be ones and twos, and you can pay off your car like that with ones and twos. Just get it up to Canada. The guy in the U.S., especially, I'd say, a majority of Canadian agencies are tracing now, so that makes it a lot better. I mean, like I think it was last year, the Mounties traced over 7,000 firearms. They're doing a remarkable job. And then you have the Quebec Provincial Police, the SQ, they traced 3,100 themselves on top of that.
Right.
Then you have FATE unit, which is out of OPP, the CISO, it's called Criminal Intelligence Service Ontario, traced another 3,000 for the province of Ontario. So you have Ontario, Quebec, which do their own tracing, and then the rest of Canada. So you had over 13,000 firearms traces last year. It's compared to like 2,000 maybe 5 years ago. So the significant increase in firearms tracing has led to a significant increase in firearms investigations going down south. That ATF's allowed to, or that not allowed to, but that ATF is now able to identify the purchases on that side of the border. Just say you're tracing 2,000 guns. Now, how many of those guns, would just say it's 44%. Just say back when they were tracing about 2,000 guns a year across Canada, maybe 2,500. out of that subset, just say 44% are U.S. sourced. Just make it 1,000.
Yeah.
Now, how many of those 1,000 are under the 1 year time to crime for ATF to investigate fruitfully? See, now when you take that number and you multiply it by 7, now everything goes up 7 times. Now we got much better numbers to work with when we get more participation on tracing. It's a direct correlation between tracing and identifying bad guys.
So the numbers have gone up in tracing. What are some of the best practices or the tools? Because clearly, I think technology must be really helping out in the ability to trace and share information. So, what are some of the best practices that you've seen that have really helped organizations up their tracing numbers and be more effective in this?
There's basically it's in PROS, it's in Prime, it's in most police databases. There's a form, I think it was the 1726, that's in Prime and PROS. And I know that different municipal POJs, they're called police jurisdictions, have their own systems, but they have easy access to the form as a fillable PDF. They don't even need a system. Like, there's a system set up in Quebec, Ontario, and the RCMP. Any agencies outside Quebec and Ontario that want to trace their firearms just have to get this form. Send it into the RCMP Tracing Center, and they'll trace the firearm for you. Okay. And send you the results right back. The thing is, the most effective means to tracing is to make it from the top down. It has to come from the top down. Because you can't have like ones and twos, like, oh, just say a unit, just say a guns and gangs unit. Like most POJs have a guns and gangs unit. They may trace very well. What about the Berg unit? What about the patrol? Patrol pulls a lot of guns, but if it doesn't go to guns and gangs, it may not get traced in that department, you know? Or if it's a domestic unit, domestic violence, you show up and there's 3 guns at the place. Do they trace them? You know, if it's not a top-down system, you don't get a good view of all the guns coming into a department.
So do we do this nationally in Canada? Like you say top-down. So is this driven nationally, or the provinces and towns and everybody has the ability to make their own decision on how to?
They have their own ability. They can make their own decision. Like just say like police department like Calgary, like Mark Neufeld. It's important to Mark Neufeld, so he makes it important. And then all of a sudden the trace numbers go to the roof in Calgary. You know what I mean? Like, and other departments like Edmonton's been kicking butt and Vancouver's been kicking butt. Like, we just got to get it like more in the hinterlands too. So like the crops officers from each division, if they make it a priority, like then it would be important to them. Then it's important to the constables. Then it's something that they would look for up top. And you know, like a lot of the traces that we're missing, because you never know what you're missing. You know, It's like, how do you know what you don't know? Like, I just know that the numbers probably would peak at about, just from, if you read the Canadian Firearms report, it's generally they recover between 30 and just say 35,000 firearms a year in Canada, across Canada.
Okay.
And that's a Commissioner of Firearms report. It's published every year. So out of that number, when you look at provincial stats, those numbers should generally be about 40 to 60% crime guns when you go from province to province. Okay. Like, just say you get a province like Alberta, maybe they recover 5,000 guns in the province. 2,500 or so should be crime guns traced, because there's a lot of guns that are recovered that are, you know, like somebody passes away and they had a PAL. Right. And they have 10 rifles in there. Well, those cops take until the next of kin could get a PAL. Or sometimes they just turn over custody to the police. Those aren't crime guns. Those are just guns that are taken into custody. So there's custodial firearms.
So that's all in the 30, 35,000.
Yep, that's a total number. But if you look at each province, it's generally between 40 and 60% are crime guns of that total number. So just say like BC has 7,000. I'm not sure if that's the exact number. I'm just making up numbers here right now. But just say like Alberta, 5,000. You look for a good number of 2,500 would be a good estimate of that they're doing most of their crime guns. Some, of course, you don't know have fallen through the cracks, but generally speaking, that would be a great ratio. And now, if you get 1,000 guns recovered in New Brunswick, I'm looking at 500, you know, or Halifax, if they recover 1,200, I want the 600 range. Just, that would show you that it's important to them. And I think any department could get those stats anytime they wanted. Some departments wouldn't have those stats years ago. Now they have those stats. And they're doing an amazing job in most POJs across the country. It's a big country to cover. Like, I've been doing this for 5 years now. I've been to every province multiple times, and it's just, you see that it, and I'm not saying I single-handedly did this, I'm just saying since I've been here in 2019 to now, that's all I could speak to. What they were doing beforehand, you could look at the stats, average is 2,000, 2,500 a year, probably year over year for the last 20 years, probably even 30 years. The stats only go back, I think, to 2008, most stats, and they were like 800 one year back then, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think they're getting more guns per se, but I think we're seeing the guns now, and they're getting traced, and they're actually putting a stop to it by getting that guy Joe down in Florida.
Right.
Because in the past, if you're not getting Joe, you're not ever going to stop the flow.
So, do the law enforcement agencies in Canada then have to, in order to pass that information down to the ATF or the U.S., is there an official relationship that needs to be established? Do all Canadian law enforcement already have that relationship with the ATF or whatever the organization is in the U.S. so that Joe can be picked up in Florida?
Yes. At this point in time, I think, like last year, me and my guy in Toronto, along with two other Canadians that assist us, like we got secondments from an OPP.
Okay.
And then we have a retiree, it's called LES, Locally Employed Staff, who's a retired Toronto police officer. Like last year, we trained 4,300 cops across 10 provinces, just in 1 year for the four of us.
Yeah.
The year before, it was like 3,000 cops. It's just spreading the word. It's going to these conferences like the Economist Forum, talking about tracing.
Yeah. Getting
these police chiefs to understand it, going to CACP, talking about it, going to like the Safer Streets thing that Chief Del McPhee arranged for Edmonton. Going out there, I presented at that. Safer Cities or something. Safer Cities conference that he organized. Had like 600 attendees. I think Del McPhee was instrumental in organizing that. These things are so important to get the word out. So it becomes like orders of magnitude. The more people you tell, and I've told most Canadian cops this, like, tell other people about tracing. Because now it's just not these 2 or 3 or 4 voices in Canada. Then it becomes the RCMP Tracing Center. They send out people now. Quebec sends out people from the Tracing Center at these conferences in Canmore, like the Alert Conference in Canmore every 2 years they have. Quebec presents, Ontario presents, RCMP presents, ATF presents. It's about firearms tracing and trafficking. So it's just getting the word out, and it's making sure that people understand the importance of firearms trafficking when it comes to Canada specifically. You share the largest undefended border in the world with a place that estimate of 400 million firearms are down in the United States. Estimate. I don't know what the number is actually, but it's and you having the largest undefended border in the world, it's paramount for you guys to trace. Paramount. Like if an agency is not tracing, they're doing their community a disservice. That's how important it is. If you're getting one pistol up in Nunavut or up in Yellowknife, or that one pistol trace could be a connection to some friend in Texas or Georgia or Ohio or Nebraska. Who knows, But if you get that one gun, how did that gun get there? How did that firearm get there? Well, we have to know that, because the only way ATF can help Canada and Canadian law enforcement is to know where that gun was sourced. And if you don't trace it, we'll never know. We don't have a way to know.
So when you do training, I mean, because all I can think of is, some of the obstacles to not doing something like this might be resources required. So when you deliver training, is it really about sort of awareness, understanding the processes of tracing and how law enforcement agencies can do that? Or is there going to be, town X in, Manitoba says, yeah, that's great, I took the training, but now I've got to spend, tens of thousands of dollars to do
free.
this?
It's completely free.
So the training's free.
The training's free. The tracing is free. The PDF is free. Everything's free. Even when Quebec set up their tracing center January 16th of 23.
Okay.
They got their own e-trace accounts. It's an online. You go on Chrome and you can trace once you're one of the hubs.
Yeah.
Like RCMP has an e-trace account. So any U.S. source gun they could trace on their own. U.S. source firearms, right in their own laptop. it's free program. It's just like you go on a website.
Who owns the program?
ATF does.
Okay.
But you get access. Once you get access to become like a tracing hub, then you get your own E-Trace account. And then you could trace any guns whenever you want, and it's all for free. So Ontario, RCMP, it's called the CNFTC, the Canadian National Firearms Tracing Center, and FATE in Ontario. So there's 3 entities in Canada that could trace and have their own like E-Trace accounts. And then they also have different accesses in Canada that we don't see, the ATF. We don't see the domestic sourced guns from Canada because, we could still trace some of those because what happens is, just say somebody recovers a rifle up here and it was imported from the United States into, just say, Manitoba. Well, sometimes the Canadians may not see that because you guys don't keep track of the imports. You guys don't mark your imports. So, the only markings on the firearm are the U.S. markings. So although it's a domestic now, it shows up at a gun shop in Manitoba, gets sold, gets converted to criminal use somewhere along somewhere along its lifetime. It gets converted to criminal use. So now, in theory, that's a domestically sourced firearm from a Canadian perspective because it started out in Manitoba, sold the first time ever in Manitoba, and then was recovered at somewhere in Saskatchewan, just say. The only record of that, before you guys had a point of sale requirement, like a record keeping requirement, was the import from the United States. So having an E-Trace account is very important for these agencies like that want to have it. Like just say a Quebec Tracing Hub, the Quebec Tracing Center didn't have an E-Trace account. Well, it'd be very difficult for them to identify the, just say 44 to 55% of the guns that sourced in the U.S. You know what I mean? So having an E-Trace account would be very important if you want to be like a centralized hub. And from a Canadian perspective, if you don't trace that firearm, you're doing the community a disservice. It's just, I can't stress that enough. I've said that at most of my conferences that I speak at. Because it's free. There's no program requirements. There's no anything. If you're up in, like I said, up in Whitehorse, I know the Mounties up there, they're a great group of guys. They get a gun recovery. All they got to do is go on the pros, fill out the 1726, and hit submit. And it goes right to CNFTC in Ottawa.
Right.
Like, there's nothing. If you're a POJ, like a local police department, just say Saskatoon, they go on there. Maybe they don't have pros. They have a PDF. It's a fillable PDF. You type in that bad guy's information or the suspect's information, type in the recovery location, and type in the gun information. Send it in. Email it to CNFTC, and they'll trace it for you. And, of course, Quebec and Ontario now do it their own way for all their police of jurisdiction within their own provinces. So they have a much like a streamlined approach to it. Because you got one entity is running everything, So you got OPP that oversees most of Ontario policing. And then you got SQ that oversees all of Quebec policing. So they make it like mandatory. If you get a gun, you're tracing it within whatever time in Quebec. Same thing in Ontario. The rest of the country is very diverse and disparate and different POJs. And the Mounties only have so much authority over a POJ.
Right.
They can only say, we recommend you trace. They can't force it. It has to be the chiefs of police that are involved. And I've spoken to a lot of the chiefs of police at the police, like at the New Brunswick Association Chiefs of Police Conference. I go out to NSACP. I go out to MACP in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Like I go out to all of these and tell these chiefs that this is important.
So is this federally regulated in the U.S.? So regardless of your jurisdiction in the U.S., do you have to follow this tracing protocol?
Yes, in theory. I mean, ATF asks, well, just say ATF regulates the firearms industry. So on the commercial end, on the, like, just say Dallas PD wasn't tracing. We can't force them to trace. But if they are tracing and the gun dealers are saying, no, I'm not going to tell you, then that becomes a mandate. They're mandated to respond to ATF within 24 hours of getting a trace request. Just by you having your license, but this is part of your obligation, is you have to tell us who you sold it to. Mm-hmm. And that's like normal in the ATF. We got police departments across the U.S. that don't trace. It's just like sometimes these PDs have no idea, or an ATF, ATF's not a big agency, so there are gaps in the U.S. where there's no ATF agents, or
Sure.
cops may not have seen an ATF agent in 10 years,
Right.
because if nothing's going on out there.
Well, it sounds like we have an advantage here in Canada that, this is free. You're going to be able to not just sort of immediately, but in the long term, reduce the number of guns that are flowing into Canada, because you're going to get those
At the source.
And sharing that information, I can only imagine, is of benefit to the wider community and the country. So
Yeah, we sent down in 2019, I think we sent down 50 investigations.
okay,
2 years ago, we sent down 240. Just to show you, without the traces, we don't see who to investigate.
yeah,
So we had a 5-fold increase in the number of investigations we sent down south. And sometimes it's like a stolen gun. It's not always we send an investigation down, somebody's getting arrested. You know what I mean? It's like sometimes things happen. The guy left his gun in a car and it got broken into, and the gun. But it's a lead, and now we talk to the cops who are investigating the car prowl. Like, who stole that? And now we see if maybe we identify a guy that is friends with some Canadian guy. And then the Canadian guy has a connect up there. It's a long chain to get back in each one of these 236 tentacles that are sent down south. Like, just imagine 230 grappling hooks getting sent down south. When you drag them back, sometimes some come up empty, but you're doing much better than sending 50 down. That's for sure, because if you get 10%, now you got 5 for that 1 year, and you get 25 for the next year. 25 is way better, especially if you're talking about firearms trafficking.
So does it ever work the other way? Do you ever get, you said we don't really have a massive organic gun manufacturing industry. So is there ever sort of stuff that comes back up, tracing from, Joe is not in Florida, but Joe is in Timmins or Saskatoon or Chilliwack.
Guns to the U.S.
Or Chilliwack.
It's
I can't imagine it's a huge thing.
No.
Yeah.
It's not. I would imagine that some of the local, some of the more recent legislation that has been passed, I know just from hearing from the POJs and the provinces that they were worried about people exporting their guns, so importing them into the U.S. either legally or illicitly, if they met one of the bans. If it was a banned
I see what
weapon.
you're saying. Right.
But then again, even if you had a pre-ban weapon and now it's locked down, you generally paid more money for it than what you could get in the United States for it, right? Because the price of importing that firearm and then you paying for it in Canada and then trying to sell it in the U.S. for any profit, it's almost impossible, because the gun is going to be cheaper.
Right.
That same make and model is going to be less expensive in the United States. So it'd be hard to import something, It's like, going into a movie theater with your own popcorn maker, and it costs
Right.
double the amount than the popcorn in the theater. Nobody's going to be going to you. Wants to buy a gun that's triple the value in Montana. It just won't happen. I haven't seen it. I know people were worried about it when the initial legislation was passed, and I reassured them, I don't think people need to import firearms into the United States. Mm-hmm. It's not things that we see that often.
Yeah,
Guns coming in. It's dope coming in, guns going out, generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, across the board. Dope comes in, guns get exported. And that's why wherever our guns get exported, that's why ATF sends attachés, especially to the regional areas like Colombia, Central America, the Caribbean, Mexico, Canada. That's our massive footprint, because it's the spillover.
So the training is critical, and it sounds like the training is paying off for the organizations that are running that and that are embracing it. Are there next steps beyond that to allow Canada to do even more with tracing or more with dealing with firearms?
The next, last year, it's 20, so it's at the beginning of 23 when Quebec opened their tracing center, and they just hit the ground running. They went from maybe 100 guns traced 2 years ago to 3,000.
Wow. Okay.
Amazing. Once the SQ made it a priority, then it was a priority. It didn't just go from trickle along. This thing jumped. I don't even know. I had to go on Google one time and figure out what the percentage increase was, because you can't even. last time I was in math class was like, in college sometime, like 20-something years, 30 years ago.
Never do math in public. That's one of my tenets
like
in
literally,
life.
it was 10, you can't even, it's probably 20, 30 time increase in 2023. And this year there's going to be more. Because they recover maybe 7,000, 8,000 guns in Quebec. Maybe they should be at 4,000. Imagine they're almost at their mark within 1 year of opening the tracing center. They're doing an amazing job. Ontario's still, they hit 3,000 guns for the first time like last year, right around 3,000 in Ontario. And like I said, the Mounties, they're up to 7,000 guns last year that they traced. So like last year, I made a mental note to myself to push out the ballistics imaging, the national, we call it NIBIN in the U.S. It's a CIBIN up here. It's Canadian Integrated Ballistics Imaging Network.
Okay. And
what it is it's these machines that when you have a shooting at, just say, a bar or something, or a drive-by shooting at a house, the shell casings come out of the firearm and the little brass shell casings are on the ground. In scientific parlance, they're called FCCs, fired cartridge casings. So now just say you get a drive-by shooting in a house, no problem. Just say a homicide, there's 5 shell casings. Somebody in Toronto shot, just say, 5 times. They pick up these shell casings and they put them in this machine. It's called brass tracks, and it uploads an image of the rear end of the shell casing where the percussion is.
Mm-hmm.
I forget it. It's not a blasting cap. It's where the firing pin hits.
Mm-hmm.
It takes the marks that are left there, and it's brass, so it's indented by the firing pin, it's indented by the ejection rod, by the breech face. It leaves an indelible mark into that brass.
A fingerprint, really.
Fingerprint. Yeah. So then when you enter that into the system, just say you enter that into the system, it's now floating around in the cloud in Canada. That's CIBIN. It's like the network that ties it all together. So now you got a machine in Edmonton that could upload stuff and get pulled down by something in Toronto, because the same gun might have went out there. You know what I mean? So, So now just say there's a homicide in Winnipeg. Winnipeg's another great example. These guys do an amazing job with the CIBIN system. So there's a shooting in Winnipeg, unsolved. The guy's dead on the street on Monday. Let's just use Joe because that's an easy name. It's kind of nondescript. Joe gets pulled over on Tuesday by Winnipeg Police Service with a gun in his waistband. No problem. Same case we were just talking about earlier. The cop would come in, put it on the pegboard in the old days, and it would be a possession charge. But in Winnipeg, they test fire the gun immediately on Tuesday. They enter the shell casing into this brass tracks machine. It goes up to the cloud. By Wednesday or Thursday, they know that gun was used at that homicide on Monday. So now your possession charge with Joe, with the gun in his waistband, it doesn't mean he's the one that pulled the trigger. But he's very close to the person that killed the guy on Monday.
Right.
All because of this ballistics imaging now. So now you go from a normal possession charge to a bail hearing on Thursday or Friday where the guy may get bail. It might be his first offense for a possession charge. But now the Crown is able to say, wait a minute. Excuse me, Judge, that gun was used in a homicide the day before we arrested Joe with it. Well, now the judge holds the guy. Now it gives you time to investigate. Investigate that homicide. Now you got this guy. You match up his phone records. See if he was in that area. See if anybody saw a car that looked like his car. Like what didn't look like a lead before, now it looks very much like a lead because of this ballistics imaging, this CIBIN system. So that's what I've been trying to push across the country, is like getting that going. I mean, they're doing a good job of it, but we just got to keep pushing them because it is so important. Canada generally has about 250 firearms homicides a year.
250, okay.
250 across the board.
Yeah.
And I keep telling my Canadian counterparts, that's like compared to the United States, it's always like you guys compare yourself to the United States. It's like, well, it's not that bad. Well, it's like, yeah, but because you have so few means you should be doing each one 100% right. You know what I mean? Like, if there's something to be done, it should be done the right way. You shouldn't be waiting 6 months or 3 months for a result to come back. You should do it like Winnipeg or Calgary or Edmonton or Vancouver, where they turn around within a day or two. Sometimes you have a shooting in an area that's not covered by one of these machines, and it could take 6 months. So now the shooting happens on Monday. Tuesday you get pulled over. It's a possession charge. Thursday, Friday, it's a possession charge. They let them out on bail. 3 months later, they plead guilty, whatever. They take their probation or whatever they get on first offense. Maybe 6 months or a year later, they get the results back saying it was used in a homicide the day before. But it's a little late for that.
Right.
You need it quick, and it's got to be timely. It's got to be within 24 to 48 hours. If you're going to use it effectively.
So a couple of questions on that. Are the Canadian American databases linked? So if you have that guy gets picked up in Winnipeg and they test fire it and they put it into, what's it called, brass tracks?
Yeah, the machine is called
brass tracks, and they put it into the database. Could they find out if that was a homicide that wasn't Toronto, but it was a homicide in Chicago?
The systems don't talk.
Okay.
Like on a normal basis. The guy in Winnipeg, the police officer in Winnipeg, would have to contact the hub of Cybin is at the RCMP.
Okay.
So they have a program manager there that controls, basically, not controls, but manages the entire national network for Canada. It's like a gatekeeper. So that gatekeeper would talk to our gatekeeper. So it's not naturally shared with us automatically because of the, you guys have your own privacy rights and everything else. But if that police officer in Winnipeg says, hey, program manager of Cybin, can you push that image south to just say the gun was traced and it came back to Dallas? Because America's system is so massive that it's quadrants. Like we don't do a national search.
Okay.
We're going to be on that soon, with the advent of advances in technology. But right now the server farms are only so big so they could like do Southeast U.S. or Northeast or New England. So just say the gun is traced out of Dallas. The guy in Winnipeg could say, hey, program manager, can you push that image to Dallas quadrant and just see? And that may cover Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. It may cover that big area. I'm not sure where the geography begins or ends. Texas could be their own. Mm-hmm. But that would be a good lead for them to see, push it down there. And we've gotten matches before that way. But it's not automatic.
Okay. So the system's called Cybin?
Cybin, Canadian Integrated Ballistics Information Network. And it's managed by the RCMP headquarters. So
what's the type of investment that's required to get on this in terms of like the machine or getting a license or whatever it is?
I think right now Saskatchewan just bought a machine a year ago and it's operational. I think like last week. The CFO's office out in Saskatchewan invested in this. It cost them I think $170,000 for the machine, and then there's like the maintenance costs. I'm not exactly sure. But the machines are manufactured right here in Montreal, so it's a Canadian machine that's being used, like a Canadian manufactured machine. Like I put them in touch with the people in Montreal, and then they work out the finances. I know it's the same machines ATF uses. It's, right now, I don't know of any other machines that we use in the States. I know we use brass tracks, and it's like from this company in Montreal, and the CFO out in Saskatchewan bought his. I think it was about 170, but there's like lease programs too.
So it's not a crazy amount of money
for a province. 170,000. That's like dust on a decimal point. That's really not a lot of investment if you think about the impact it costs on society for a homicide. Like the Fate Unit does a great write-up of the costs of society of a homicide, and it's like $800,000 or something. Like one person, the tax revenue, just say the government creates off him, the impact on his family or her family, the unemployment that goes up, the medical costs and stuff, the time off that the people need. They take all of this into account. It's a really interesting algorithm that they use in Ontario. But just that's one homicide. Now you figure if your province, just say Saskatoon has 10 homicides, which is relatively like low by U.S. standards. It's high by British and European standards. But just like Montreal has like 30 or so a year. It's well worth it for them. Like to buy a couple of machines or a lease. They got leases now. Like I'm looking at leases for the Maritimes. Like just say PEI and Newfoundland. They may not need a whole machine. Like they may want to lease one. Like, you know what I mean? Because they don't have 500 shootings. Like with a leased one, I think you get 500 entries or something like that. And it costs you $40,000 a year. I'm not sure about the exact numbers. But truly, 40 grand for Newfoundland or one of the Maritimes. I think Halifax is actually buying a machine right now, Halifax, for the province, for the entire province, because they could use one for the entire province of Nova Scotia. The population would justify it. The number of recoveries justifies it, because now, just say the province recovers 1,000 guns a year. Well, just say 500 of those are crime guns, right? So now, you'd want to test fire all 500 of those guns, right? And now, just say there's 100 shootings. I'm not even sure. I don't know. Right away, you're over the lease amount, right? So then you have to. So for a province like Nova Scotia, it pays for them to buy it, because then they got it every year. They don't have to. All they have is maintenance costs. Or if you get PEI, they may have 10 recoveries, 5 shootings. They're not going to buy a machine.
Right.
They could just use. They could pay per use at Nova Scotia. New Brunswick may need a machine because they're a little bit bigger population, but PEI and Newfoundland would definitely not need a machine on their own. Maybe Newfoundland and PEI would do a lease, a combined lease, maybe.
So there's all sorts of options.
There's so many options.
Yeah, okay.
It's not hard to do. It's just getting the political willpower to invest that much money into it for these provinces. Like Saskatchewan finally got on the grid, so now we got machines in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan. It was a gap. The CFO's office addressed that and fixed that. The CFO out there in Alberta and Saskatchewan are amazing. They're really, really good, great partners and very forward-thinking on this. Manitoba's good to go as far as Winnipeg. We got to get D division. Like hopefully in the near future we'll have Winnipeg doing it for D, because D may not have as many. You know what I mean? They may not have the resources to need their own. So each province. I was looking at provincial models, so you don't have to crush the federal system. Having the provinces do it like locally, because then you don't have to ship anything. You don't have to do anything. It's like right there, controlled by the province. Boom. You could get a result back in 2 days, like if it's right there. Instead of shipping a gun, you just test fire it, put the brass right in the machine, boop, it's in the cloud. Then the RCMP will process it within 2 days. But if you ship them the gun to do it all, and then it gets to the back of the line. So it's much easier to do it if you have a machine locally. So that's ballistics imaging, and that's what I've been working on the past, probably 12 months now. After Quebec got going, and now been trying to push that. Now Halifax and the Nova Scotia Department of Justice, they are acquiring a machine. I think public safety or justice, I get them confused out there, because ours is we don't have that at the federal level. We have DOJ for us. So, but in the province, they have public safety sometimes and justice, 2 separate departments. Justice is more like lawyers. Public safety, I think, is cops. Is my impression of most of the systems. But I think it was Department of Public Safety in Nova Scotia is the one that acquired the machine. I think they're going to put it right in Halifax. So that's a great thing, because now that'll be the first machine out in the Maritimes.
Hey, Chris, before we wrap up, anything else you want to share with the listeners about what you do with the ATF, or things you think are worth the listeners knowing about firearms and tracing?
One of the big things I notice across every province is when you look at Canadian firearms violence or firearms recoveries and trafficking, it's always compared to the U.S. And a lot of I've talked to a lot of Canadians about this. You're a tenth of our population. You generally reflect a 10% rate on most things with us tracking. For fentanyl, ODs, you guys have 10% of what we have.
Okay.
Most things, like heart attacks, we're very similar cultures. The firearms violence, we get an exponential increase over you guys. It's not the tenfold; it could be 100-fold at times, depending on the city. When I just mentioned, we have 250 firearms homicides in Canada on average each year. That could be a couple of months in a major American city. So there's this belief that Canadians oh, we're good because they're bad. It's I tell them, look across the pond. There's 75 million people in England, and they have a quarter of your homicides. So adjust your lens. Don't think just because you're less than us, it makes it better. You should still strive to be even better than you are. Look across the pond. Look at Norway. Look at your partners over there. They look at Canada like it's the Wild West, because you guys have this big country next to you that has very high rates of firearms violence. So you get to sit there and rest on your laurels a little bit. But if you look across the pond, England looks at you guys like you guys look at us. So it's just something to keep in mind so that you don't like rest on your laurels, that you keep pushing the ball. 250 is probably too much for Canada. It really is. Like as a 5-year honorary Canadian at this point, I think it's too much. I think you guys could do more. And I think if you stop judging yourself against us and judge yourself against England or one of these other countries, your partners in Europe, then maybe there'd be more of you'd free yourself from that burden of resting on your laurels. And you could say, you know what, we can do better and we should do better. And you guys, I know deep down inside you guys can. And when I return here, if I stay up here after I retire or whatever, 10 years from now, I guarantee you're going to be doing better than you would have been without Simon and without Tracy. So I need your listeners to do that. Look across the pond and see what they're doing. I really appreciate your time, Chris. And I really appreciate this opportunity.
Hey, thanks, Chris. This has been great. Thanks for inviting me into the embassy. And thanks for being one of our first honorary Northern Sentinel.
That's awesome. I love it, buddy.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, buddy.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Chris Taylor. Please take a minute to subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.